Happy Wednesday. You are tuned into Empowerment Radio, and I'm your host, Dr. Friedemann Schaub. How she says it so nicely. I love it. And basically today we are talking about what so many are struggling with. So many that have been like me, relying heavily on their intellect, on their rational mind, on the answers that come from the head to navigate through life. And then you wake up and you have a bad hair day. You wake up and you feel like the whole world somehow is bad, or you feel the people in your life are not respecting you, or they are against you, or you feel that this is going to be one of those days where everything's going to be wrong, or you are with a client and then 5 minutes into your meeting, you realize that this client is pushing a button that has been there for a long time. Maybe your father or your mother had installed this button. Maybe there was a little doubt in a question this client was asking, or maybe you felt like the client wasn't fully taking you serious, and boom, you feel the emotions rising. They are erupting like little volcanoes inside of you, and all your just being together demeanor, all that sense of feeling in charge completely disappears because your emotions have taken over. And once the emotion take over, it's a skip and a hop down into a pit of fear, of stress, of anger, of maybe feeling ashamed and guilty, you name it. Now, the interesting thing about emotions is that they are not only extremely powerful when it comes to taking our attention. I mean, we feel emotions. Sometimes, you could say emotions are really stronger than a toothache because they can be all-consuming. You cannot really compartmentalize. The problem is also that they make the reality and how you see it completely distorted. They are the major filters of your mind. I mean, how many times have you had the opposite, that you were feeling really positive, maybe newly in love, maybe you just got a raise at work and everything is sunshine and butterflies and unicorns and all feels great. Well, and then the people around you that live pretty much in the same life, they feel completely different because their filter may have been a filter of half glass empty or never really get anywhere. And that is how their emotions have clouded their experience of life and their reality. So the point is that the emotions are so powerful, and unfortunately, no one seems to teach us on how to deal with emotions. Well, I don't know, my parents never talked about it, besides maybe, boys don't cry. We boys have heard that many times, or that you have to pull yourself together, or, you don't have to be so upset. And now when we are told basically to suppress our emotions and not really feel them or not really show them, at least to other people. Now, what happens is, of course, as you are suppressing your emotions and you're learning that you're only acceptable if you're rather unemotional, or at least, feeling like happy, but don't show anything else, they are piling up. They become, somehow the baggage that we are carrying around. And just like a pressure cooker or a bathtub, we just feel like at some point we are so filled that there's just a little tiny trigger necessary for the overflow, for the eruption to happen. So suppressing doesn't really help. So how come that no one ever shows us how to deal and control emotions? And is it even possible? Now, a study that came out in the Journal of Neurosciences showed that you can actually train yourself to be in control of your emotions. Doesn't that sound fabulous? Now, keep in mind, controlling emotions doesn't mean at all that you're, again, suppressing them, not feeling anything, ignoring it. Controlling your emotions means that you are able to acknowledge your feelings and then ideally also respond to them. Notice where they come from, notice what they actually mean, and then go about either addressing that what causes them or continuing with what you had been focusing on. So that's ideal because your emotions not only are in many ways that fuel that makes life interesting, but they are also very important, like say messengers from the inside that give you valuable information. Now, how do we do that? Well, in that study, they found that parts of the brain, and I like the brain, but I'm more a mind and conscious, subconscious, higher conscious mind guy. But again, it was very interesting because in that study, they found that part of the brains that are using emotional control and are using the short-term memory, that those parts are kind of overlapping. In other words, if you are practicing something in terms of short-term memory, whether it's like, remembering what you wanted to buy in the store, even though you forgot your shopping list, or maybe you were in the midst of doing something, you got interrupted, and then you remember the train of thought that you were on before. That's all short-term memory or working memory. So what the scientists found, if you train that, just like by little memory training games, and you are, while you're training this, for example, exposed to violent images or disturbing words, eventually your mind is able then to control any other triggers or inputs in ways that you can acknowledge it, but you can still continue with whatever task you have been doing. And of course, there was a control group that just played around, didn't train their memory, and they were much more affected by the test where they were showing movies or any kind of images that were more stress evoking. So, in other words, it is possible for our mind to be so well trained that we are aware of our emotions, but we can direct our mind to address them and to respond to them rather than to let them take over or react to them. Now, I don't believe necessarily that doing memory games will make you completely zen and in emotional control, but I believe there are other ways that we can really work with our emotions. And one of those ways is the so-called pattern interrupt. And what that basically means is that you are noticing, I'm going down into an emotional pattern. I had a client today who has a pattern of getting upset and angry when someone is pushing her. And so that pattern interrupt for her gives her the chance when she notices already she gets tense or her eyes are starting to roll or she feels like that she is about to say something maybe hurtful or lashing out. She can now stop that pattern by recognizing, okay, I'm going down in that spiral. So instead, I'm redirecting my mind to maybe taking a deep breath in. Or I'm redirecting my mind by excusing myself and saying, you know what, I'm just going to go for a quick walk around the block and then I'm going to feel better. Or other ways can be that you do actually roll your eyes up to the top of your head, because what happens is that you are further away from your emotions, are more connecting to your visual center, which is more the unemotional center of your brain. And therefore you are creating a disruption of that spiral and also a safe distance from that emotional overload. So there are many things. Drinking a glass of cold water, breathing only through your left nostril, wonderful, wonderful ways of interrupting the pattern. And when you do this often enough, you will learn that your emotions no longer have to take over, but your emotions can actually be something that you are using to navigate better through life without losing traction. Now, today's guest is an expert on one of those, I believe, most effective pattern interrupts and also ways to deal and control the emotions that we have been maybe struggling with, which is EFT or emotional freedom technique. His name is Dawson Church. He's the editor of Energy Psychology, Theory, Research, and Treatment. It's a peer-reviewed professional journal, and he is also the founder of EFTuniverse.com. So after the break, I will invite Dawson to come on and we will talk about EFT, what it is, what it does, and you will have the chance to also call in and have a sample session with him. So if you want to know what it can do for you to use this fabulous technique to just get out of this emotional spiral, to no longer feel held hostage by your emotions, call in, and the call-in number is 888-418-6890. That's again 888-418-6890. We will be right back. Well, welcome back to Empowerment Radio, and I am here with my wonderful guest, Dawson Church, and I don't believe that on Empowerment Radio I have ever talked about EFT or energy psychology, even though I am using it and helping to teach it to my clients so that they have another wonderful and effective tool in their toolbox. But Dawson will talk much more about it because he is the expert. So Dawson, thank you so much for hopping on the show today.
It is so good to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you and I have met a long time ago, and it was so really interesting how our paths have been crossing again. And so, yeah, it's certainly that I can see you and I have been following our passion and our purpose, and you have found EFTuniverse.com, and a fabulous website, a great resource, by the way, for anyone to find out more about this tool. But let's talk about EFT, because a lot of people may not even know what it is. So can you explain it?
I certainly can, and it fits right into what you were saying earlier, Friedemann, about the importance of emotional regulation. And I think emotional regulation actually is the key to happiness. Because if you can regulate your emotions, then good things happen, bad things happen, and whatever happens in the course of your life, you have the ability to make choices and be wise about what you do. You aren't being your behavior isn't being determined by your emotions. Your thoughts aren't being determined by your emotions. And once you have that, you have emotional freedom. And emotional freedom techniques is simply a combination of elements of cognitive therapy, exposure therapy, along with acupressure. And so the exposure therapy part in EFT is that we focus on what's bothering you. And that may seem like an obvious thing to do, but most of us spend most of our time trying to avoid what's bothering us. If we feel pain, we want the pain to go away. If we feel emotional upset, we want to feel calm. And so most of us would rather not think about the bad things in our lives or feel the bad physical sensations in our bodies. And EFT actually has
hold on. So are you saying that you can do with EFT both emotional and physical pain?
Yes, in fact, I'm working now on a meta-analysis of EFT for physical complaints, things like fibromyalgia and psoriasis, physical pain, cravings, and so on. And there are about 30 studies in this meta-analysis, and we're showing that EFT has a massive treatment effect on physical ailments as well as emotional ones. Because when you feel, I'll give you an example. I was doing a presentation on EFT many years ago, and there were about maybe 60 people in the room, and I worked with several people on their problems. And one guy in the room, and again, I was very new to EFT then, one guy in the room had a broken leg, and he hobbled in on crutches. He'd broken his leg in a car crash 2 weeks before. And whenever I wanted to volunteer, this guy would raise his one hand, kind of balancing himself on his crutches. And I thought, Friedemann, there's no way that a psychological method like EFT can work on something like a broken leg that's 2 weeks old. The guy said he had an 8 out of 10 pain level in his broken leg. And I thought, well, there's no way, I don't want to work with this guy because it's a physical complaint. But this guy was so enthusiastic. He kept raising his hand when I asked for volunteers. So eventually I said, okay, let's see. I didn't think I'd have much effect. But as I began to do EFT with this guy, it turned out there were all kinds of emotional layers to his broken leg. He was afraid his leg wouldn't heal. He was afraid that he'd have pain for a long time. He was angry at the other driver, the driver of the other car that hit him. He was angry at his wife because he said his wife made him drive that day and he didn't want to go on that particular trip. So there was all this emotion. And again, that boiled down to in his childhood, people made him do things he didn't want to do, his parents, his teachers. So we did EFT on all of this stuff. And eventually, his pain went from an 8 out of 10 to a 2 out of 10. So that was the emotional component of physical pain. And in various studies, other studies, there are many studies of EFT for pain now, we find that pain drops by about 2/3 when you use EFT. So absolutely, emotions are a huge part of our physical complaints. I'll just use one other example. Two studies. One found that adrenaline, your main hormone you secrete in response to emotion. You secrete adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline literally blocks the expression of a gene that codes for an enzyme that kills cancer cells. And so when you have high emotion, when you're remembering the car crash or in the middle of a stressful situation, that adrenaline literally blocks the action of this enzyme that allows your body to identify and kill cancer cells. So that is having a marked effect on your physical body. There are not just one study, there are dozens of studies now that show that emotion produces high hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Those high levels of those hormones have a huge effect on you physiologically. So absolutely, emotions are physiological. They're not just psychological.
Very much so. I can completely, there are studies that say that stress is these days the bigger or the biggest component when it comes to developing illnesses. 70% of doctor visits, and this is not just because people feel emotionally bad, but actually because they have physical ailments, are stress and anxiety related. So yeah, I totally see that as something that needs to be addressed, which is one of the reasons why I'm so excited about these methods like EFT, because they are in some ways simple. Wouldn't you agree?
Very, very simple. And what they all have in common is they all involve physical soothing. So yoga works that way. Qigong works that way. Tai Chi, mindfulness, all of the, like breathing, heart math, all of these things use physical stimulus. So with EFT, we remember the bad thing, remember the car crash, remember the childhood bullying, whatever it might be. We remember the bad thing. That's the exposure part. We frame that then with a statement of self-acceptance. We say, even though I had the car crash, even though my big brother beat me up, whatever it might have been, I love and accept myself. So we move into self-love, and that's the frame through which we see the event as we apply acupressure. And there's a short form of EFT which uses 7 acupressure points, a long form that uses 12 acupressure points. Both of them, research shows, are tremendously effective for anxiety, for depression, for PTSD, for phobias, as well as for physical complaints. So that's the magic ingredient, is that physical stimulation of those 7 to 12 acupressure points.
Now, how did this come about? Who came up with that?
The acupressure points have been known about for many, many years. We have evidence showing, in one of my books I talk about this, I talk about the studies showing that they've been known in the Orient, at least for over 2,000 years. They've actually been known, acupuncture has been known in Western Europe for over 5,000 years, we now know. So they've been used, these points have been used by human beings for healing for literally thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And then they've been used not just in the form of needling, but also in the form of pressure or tapping on the points. So if you go for a shiatsu massage in Japan, they'll apply pressure to those points. Qigong uses tapping on the points, usually with the knuckles. With acupressure, we usually use our thumbs to stimulate these points. So they've been known for a long time, but only in the 1970s did they start to be used by pioneers. Like there was a chiropractor called John Diamond, there was a psychiatrist, and they began to experiment with using these in the modern era. So in the 70s, these methods were developed applying acupressure to both psychological and physical symptoms, and then the research really got going in earnest around 2000. There are now over 100 studies of EFT, and it shows that it's effective for all of these methods. So it was first really popularized in the 1970s by a clinical psychologist called Roger Callahan, and he was really the modern instigator of using acupressure for psychological and physical complaints.
And wasn't there like a story of, I believe also was the psychiatrist who also was using acupuncture who had a phobia of water after an almost drowning incident, and then he used those points, and then basically he found like, wow, if I'm just using these few points, because there are so many meridians and so many acupressure and acupuncture points, I mean, he kind of figured out a few that really are making a difference. So wasn't he kind of also a pioneer of EFT?
Yes, that's Roger Callahan, and he used it. His first he actually was trying all kinds of approaches with a patient called Mary, and Mary had a lifelong phobia of water, and he was treating her at his house. He had a pool. She couldn't go near the pool. She was afraid of the pool, and none of the methods he was trying with her worked. He tried all kinds of other psychology methods, and he'd reading about acupressure. So one day he asked her to tap with her fingertips, stimulate this one point. It's actually on the stomach meridian, which has to do with fear. He just was pretty much at his wit's end. And he had her do this one point, and she phoned him that evening and said, my fear of water is gone. And it's like this lifetime phobia of water is gone. She came back to his house for another session. They did the acupressure again. She then walked right up to the pool, stuck her feet in, no phobia at all. EFT, there are now 3 randomized controlled trials showing that usually between 15 and 45 minutes of EFT is sufficient to totally remove fear of flying, acrophobia, agoraphobia, claustrophobia. All of these phobias are easily treated with EFT in a single session. That doesn't mean that EFT will work for everything in one session, but it does work with phobias usually in one session.
Now, there was, of course, also Gary Craig, who I think coined the name EFT, didn't he? And so we will talk more about that. And again, if you, after the break, are interested in having a session, why not? If you are struggling with anything that you feel like nothing really helped, you have a phobia, you have some fear, you have an ailment, call in with the expert, Dawson Church, 888-418-6890, and see how EFT can help you. So we will be right back. Emotional freedom. I mean, freedom is anyhow a word I love. It's definitely a value that is very important to me. But emotional freedom technique. Isn't it great that there is a technique to have emotional freedom? A technique that is so simple, but at the same time so effective, because it does connect the mind and the body and probably something more deep inside us, and brings it all much more into a flow and harmony. Now, Dawson, tell us a little bit about that, those points, the technique, so, for people to get a feel for it, and also maybe you can offer your special gift, which is actually including a manual on the EFT.
Sure. I'd be happy to do both those things, and we'll give people a link where they can download the free EFT mini manual and try it themselves. And really, Friedemann, just trying it yourself one time is what it takes. Like when I first heard about EFT, I heard about it from a Gestalt therapist friend of mine. He said he was having a lot of success with PTSD and sports performance and other issues in his clients. And I was thinking, wow, can one technique really be effective? I was pretty skeptical of it, but then I tried it myself again, just the first time, and I found a big reduction in my anxiety level around a particular event that I was really worried about. And so trying it yourself is the crucial thing. We can talk about EFT, we can talk about stress reduction all day long, but unless you actually use these techniques, they can't help you. So the crucial thing is to download that mini manual and actually try EFT yourself, and you'll feel in your body what it does. And there are 7 key acupressure points, and they're the end points of the acupuncture meridians. And so there are over 300 acupuncture points, but they run in lines throughout your body. One of the cool things is that these lines and these points are described in this 2,000-year-old Chinese text called the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine. And so there's these diagrams showing where these energy flows are in your body, where the points are. But when I'm doing live workshops, I take a little electronic device called the skin galvanometer, which measures the amount of charge on your skin. I run it over people's skin, And we can measure exactly where these points are. The galvanometer emits a small beep, and when it finds a point of high conductivity on the skin, it beeps much, much louder. And so we now, with modern instrumentation, can identify these points. They turn out to be exactly where these ancient energy masters drew them 2,000 years ago. So these are the end points of energy meridians, and tapping them or rubbing them produces a shift in people's physiology. When they remember a bad event and they then tap, usually their level of psychological triggering goes way down. And these aren't small events. I mean, like one guy, I describe his story in the EFT manual. His best friend was killed in Vietnam, and for 40 years since Vietnam, he'd had flashbacks and nightmares, intrusive thoughts about that event. He was hypervigilant, had a lot of medical symptoms. After his first EFT session, he said to his therapist, he said, "I had my first full night's sleep last night since Vietnam 40 years ago." And he described this event where this terrible event where he'd been on patrol with his best friend in Vietnam, and they went on patrol every day. He always walked on the left, and his best friend always walked on the right. But that particular day, he was walking on the right. His best friend was on the left. They switched sides for some unknown reason, and his friend was killed by a shot in the head. So he'd had this terrible guilt, survivor's guilt, for 40 years. Huge amount of PTSD symptoms. And when he tapped with his therapist on that one memory, he suddenly had an epiphany. He said, "I just realized that just the way I wish I died in his place, I know he would have been willing to die for me." And that one insight flipped the whole way he thought about the event. He recovered quickly from his PTSD. Research shows, randomized controlled trials of EFT show that 90% of veterans recover from PTSD with EFT. 10% don't. It's not a perfect method. No method is. But for 9 out of 10 veterans, it results in permanent reduction in those symptoms. So it's potent to use these acupressure points and apply this to our negative emotional memories. It's able to
I can definitely attest to that, having it used myself, and also one of my very good friends who used to be afraid of riding his horse, and he used EFT, and since ever he is using it, he doesn't have that fear anymore. He just feels very calm. And we all know, if you are someone who is riding horses, you have to be very calm on your horse, because your horse feels and it takes on this tension. Now we have a caller who is from Seattle, and it sounds like Howard is on the line. Welcome, Howard.
Hey, hi. Thanks for taking my call.
Oh yeah, our pleasure. Thank you for calling back. Now, you have a question, or you would like to have a session with Dawson?
Could be both. The question is, how effective is tapping for dealing with the depression? And I ask that because I'm an older man, and I've been dealing with circumstances that how it occurs for me is just being depressed, and that's a heaviness, along with some resignation about my life. And so, can tapping work for depression?
Yes, and the way to apply it for depression is that you want to get as specific as possible to what's bothering you and go as early as possible, Howard. So tapping on just the general problem and phrase of depression isn't likely to have much effect. But if you think about things that circumstances, life circumstances that depress you, these might be in your realm of money or relationships or health or whatever it might be, but think about exactly what it is that's triggering those heavy feelings right now. And then usually we don't tap on those. We go back earlier. And what we find is that people's current situations are almost always a replay of early situations, and we very, very seldom do we work on issues with people that they have in their current lives. We trace those feelings back to early experiences. For example, the person who had many experiences of betrayal, or not being appreciated or not being valued in their early life will then tend to perpetuate those patterns endlessly in their current adult relationships. And so they'll come to you complaining of that issue now and how it's showing up in their lives now. Trace it back, it's almost always a replay of an early life experience. And if you work on that early life experience, then one of the wonderful things about EFT is that the current life experiences are resolved right away. One lady, for example, had an issue in one of our live workshops. She was really anguished because there was a male colleague of hers at work who was disrespectful toward her, and she was really angry at him. She was thinking of initiating a complaint against him through Human Resources Department. She felt he was dismissive of her. He was basically saying things that were hurtful and harmful toward her, and so she had a lot of anger toward him. And actually another practitioner, an EFT practitioner, worked with her on her anger toward the man, and the anger went way, way, way down. But the next day it was back. So I worked on her that second day, not on her anger toward her colleague, but we did some digging and found a similar event that happened in her early childhood where somebody had been really disrespectful toward her. So we tapped on that and an EFT on the early childhood event, and that went down to a 0. What then happened was all of her, I said that, let's talk now about your colleague at work. She said, well, I actually have a lot of compassion for this guy. He may lose his job because he's so ineffective at his work. He's kind of a loser. He's a sad guy. I realize that his acting out toward me is because he's really having a hard time in his life. And so her picture of the problem completely changed. She flipped compassion for him once she resolved her emotions around her early childhood events. That's why we always work early, if at all possible, and we don't work on the adult events. And when we successfully are able to treat the early childhood patterns, then all the replays we're doing, those replays you're having in your life right now, Howard, are just there to draw your attention to the early childhood wounding and have you heal that. When you heal that, usually all the downstream stuff just goes away in terms of emotional intensity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. When you say early childhood, when I think of early childhood, I think of like 3 to 8 to 10, but I also had some stuff go on in my early 20s that impacted me deeply too. So could those kind of experiences be just not, I guess, is the early childhood, is it necessarily just childhood stuff, or could it be later in life?
It tends, if I can work with somebody on an event that happened when they were 3, and if I have a choice between that event and an event at 20, I'll work on the one when they were 3 almost always. Now, occasionally, there's what's called single-incident PTSD, where people have some bad thing happen to them in their adult life. Maybe they had a terrible divorce at the age of 25. Maybe they had a car crash at the age of 29. So people may have those bad things in their 20s, but usually it's early. Just one lady, for example, I worked with, she was really angry at her husband, and she said that she was in her late 20s. She said, my husband just doesn't do his fair share of the housework. I'm angry at him, and I'm thinking of getting divorced. And we then honed in on one particular thing he did actually with a dish sponge that really, really triggered her. And so she was angry at her husband, thinking of getting divorced. They'd been married maybe 7 or 8 years. And so I asked her to tune into her body, see where those feelings were held in her body, and then work with those feelings. And the earliest time she remembered that same physical sensation. And she said, well, the earliest time I remember was being 3 or 4 years old, and I was raised in Bulgaria, in Eastern Europe. And in Bulgaria, the men used to do very little, the women did everything. So I remember my father and my uncles sitting around smoking cigarettes, drinking beer. My mother did everything, and the women had to do everything. My aunts had to take care of the family and money and everything. And she was so angry about that from her early childhood. So we did EFT on those early childhood memories. And then I said to her, so tell me now about your husband and the housework. And she sat there with a kind of a stunned look on her face for a few moments. And then she said, I ride him so hard I am so unreasonable. He's doing everything he can to please me, and it's never enough for me. And she burst into tears. I mean, she was so upset when she realized that this was all an expression of her early childhood wounding, and that she was just reenacting it now in her adulthood. So when we dig, it's almost always the past, and the experience happening now in your life is just a reminder. It's just a way of life bringing it to your attention. You need to heal. So that's usually why we go deep, why we go early, and that's where we find the most successful treatments occur.
Now, Howard, do you have a feeling that what happened in your 20s was maybe a reoccurrence or linked to what happened early in your life?
As you were sharing with me, I thought of an incident when I was a young boy. My mom stopped talking to me for a couple of months, it seemed like, and I
to punish
don't
you.
know how I. Pardon me.
To punish
you.
Me.
Right. And there was something about that I wasn't acknowledged. It was as if I didn't exist for her, and ultimately she thawed out, and I felt this tremendous relief for me that I was being talked to again. But I keep going back to that from time to time. I keep going to that memory, and it seems to have played out in later times, because I noticed there's been groups that I've been in or whatever it is, and I don't get acknowledged.
Right.
And it's upsetting. It's it's upsetting. It's I feel a little betrayed. Not a little betrayed, but so yeah. So in the 20s there was a group that I was a part of, and I had to leave because it wasn't because I wanted to leave. I was fired, but it was not a final termination, and that was another big thing too. But those are the two things that have two memories that from time to time come up for me.
Now, do you believe that there is also some kind of a limiting belief about yourself at play, that you may not be good enough, or that you may not be lovable or deserve to be acknowledged, and that that is also a belief that may have strung through your entire life?
Yeah, I think so. It's it's affected me in my ability to have successful relationships. That's for sure.
So, Dawson, how do you deal with limiting beliefs? I mean, going back to the childhood where the core is, the root of the limiting belief is certainly, very effective. But is there also something you can do to replace a limiting belief with a more empowering belief?
We usually use limiting beliefs like I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy of attention, whatever it might be. I don't feel acknowledged. Those were Howard's exact words. And I usually write down people's exact words because they're the way that person's brain processes information. Right. And we usually use those to test. We test our work. So how strongly do you believe that? We'll get the strength of their belief on a scale of 0 to 10. Now, this is a scale in psychology called validity of cognition, which is just a big word for strength of belief. How strongly do you believe that? But those core beliefs did not begin as beliefs. They began as events. So again, Howard, your mom gave you the silent treatment for a couple of months when you were, was that around the age of 3, did you say? How old were you then?
No, I was, interestingly enough, I was about 8 years old, and it's I don't know what happened, but the interesting thing is that in 8 or 9 years ago, my dad passed, and my mom and I had a big blowout fight that night. And it was as if she said to me, "I'm not talking to you again." And we had one conversation after that, but since that time we've had no conversations. And I've tried to clear that, and it hasn't worked. And it's still it's affected me. And so it's interesting that the replay that you talked about, it's actually occurring again.
Yeah, and so, for example, when a romantic partner doesn't listen or appears to ignore you, then you might take it as a personal affront and feel bad. But that person might just be wrapped up in their own thoughts. I know I have that particular issue in my marriage, and when I was first with my wife, I used to get so annoyed when I thought she wasn't listening. Then I realized it's just my issue. It's just that I didn't get hurt as a child, and so. she might have just been making a shopping list in her mind. She may have been trying to think about what to do in her day. That had nothing to do with me, but I was making it so personal. I was making it about me, and it wasn't about me. It wasn't personal. And so in that way, we cement these old behaviors and old beliefs in our experience over and over and over again. So I'd had, 6 relationships in my life. All of them I felt as I wasn't being heard. All they were a recapitulation of my early childhood experience when maybe I wasn't heard. So
Howard, you can go for sure to the website that Dawson has offered. It's, again, what is it? Dawson's Gift?
Dawson Gift. Just my name, D-A-W-S-O-N, Dawson Gift, GIFT.com. Download the free mini manual there. And again, Howard, I don't need to suffer with depression because research shows that people recover from depression in just a few sessions of EFT. And I'd encourage you, if you can afford it, to use a practitioner. You'll find a list of our certified practitioners on that same website. If not, just use the free mini manual. The full manual costs like $10 on Amazon. I mean, it's really inexpensive to try. And you just work systematically through your memories, one after the other. And you'll find that, again, research shows that most cases of depression lift very, very quickly. If you buy the EFT manual, there's one particular part of it I want you to look at. It's by a woman called Carrie Reed, who wrote me a long history of her depression. And the story in the manual is called Battling a Giant with Really Small Rocks. And she talks about her lifelong battle with depression, being on antidepressants, all of these things. And then she says, I learned to tap, and depression just felt so much bigger than me. I was like in this inky well of despair. But each time I would tap, it was like picking up a tiny pebble and throwing them at this giant of depression I had my whole life. And lo and behold, the little rock hits the giant, a little part of the giant disintegrates. I would tap again a few hours later or a few days later, a bit more of the giant would disappear. And she says, and eventually the giant just was gone, and now I'm free of my depression. That story it's just a very moving story from the EFT manual. I recommend.
So it also shows that you may want to work on it. It's not something that's done immediately in one session. You're just gonna peel away the layers. But we have another caller. So Howard, thank you so much for calling in. And I know we are running a little bit short on time. So
thank you very, very much.
You're so welcome. Thanks for calling in.
Thank you.
Amy, are you on the line?
I am.
I'm wonderful. Here. Amy, what can we do for you?
Well, I just wanted to share a quick story. 4 years ago, my mother had a ganglion cyst on one of her wrists. Had been there for a while. And I had just had a book out on tapping, and I showed her the technique. And if I hadn't seen it, I wouldn't have believed it, but she tapped that day, and when I went to visit her the next day, it was gone. Have you ever heard of anything like that?
Wow.
Is that fear-based thought forming a ganglion cyst?
Very possible.
That's amazing. One doctor there's a case history in the EFT manual of a doctor who gave one of his elderly patients a flu shot, and the man had an ab reaction. The next day came in the site of the flu shot had swelled up to the size of an egg, huge reaction. And this doctor, his name is Chuck Gebhardt, began to tap with this man. And he says, it's so funny in the manual that he writes, nothing in my training in physiology prepared me for what I saw as the thing just went away before his eyes in a few minutes. So it's amazing. And what I want to say, too, is that there's a new piece of research on the brain's gamma waves. And in our research, we're finding that with people with EFT, they have heightened gamma. And in one really provocative study with mice, they exposed the mice to gamma brain frequencies, and gamma again is our highest frequency of brain waves. And they found that these particular mice they were bred to have Alzheimer's. They had amyloid plaques in their brains. They found that in just 45 minutes of gamma, that half the amyloid plaques in their brains dissolved in that brief time period. So I believe our bodies are capable of rapid healing, and that most of the things we suffer from for years and years and years, chronic issues, are actually can be solved really quickly. We get traumatized in 2 seconds, by a bad thing that happens. Why can't we get untraumatized in 2 seconds? So I'm a real believer in the healing ability of our bodies, our minds, and we see miracles happen when we do this work.
Now, this is also something
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, for sharing this fascinating
All right,
story.
you're
And I think this is really something we have to just also acknowledge, that the mind-body connection is not only wishful thinking or this idea of mind over matter. It does exist. It is something that's very effective. And I believe that especially allopathic medicine needs to take more advantage of what we can actually learn from the emotions that may be underneath physical concern, and how can we use techniques like EFT or NLP or hypnosis or anything that really helps us to release those emotional charges to accelerate the healing process. And I believe that is something that is the future of medicine. And what I love about techniques like EFT is that they are something we can do on our own. And this is something that is very empowering. For Empowerment Radio, this is exactly what we are looking for. What are the things we can do to take our health back into our own hands and not feel like we have to rely on the experts in the white coats or the pills that are prescribed to us?
Right. They're always there if we need them, but
of course,
first line of defense is your emotions. The first thing to do is look at your emotional and spiritual well-being, and then use appropriate medical care. Like, I mentioned 2/3 of pain goes away, but not all the pain went away. So you may need medication, you may need surgery for the remaining 1/3 of pain that remains. But don't try and medicalize that or medicate it away, because that big 2/3 chunk of those symptoms is emotional.
Well, thank you so much, Dawson. The time went by. I know we just started 10 minutes ago, it felt. So thank you. It was such a pleasure to have you and your enthusiasm and your wisdom and your knowledge on the show. I hope we'll do this again very soon. And until next time, to Empowerment Radio, try to really begin with EFT, not just because you have big problems, also with little things that may concern you, little things that feel like, that's just not making me as free, as happy, as at peace as I want to be, and then see how it goes. And notice that this is a technique in your toolbox that can really go a long way. So thank you so much for sharing, and we will talk again. And until next time, be well, be empowered, and take good care of yourself. Goodbye.